everyone, Mary and Craig here. We are back to talk about talking to parents and teachers about stuttering. So the first question is, how can we better describe the causes of stuttering when talking to parents, so using parent-friendly terminology, especially about the neurological underpinnings of stuttering?
I think it's always best to use as plain of language as you can use when describing causes to parents, because as soon as you start getting into too many technical terms, people don't follow what you're saying and you just lose people very quickly. What I try to do for parents is just really simplify that and say, that we know that people who have a family history of stuttering are a lot more at risk for stuttering themselves because of the genetic component. We also know that from various brain imaging studies that people who stutter just use their brain for speaking a little bit differently than people who don't stutter.
Great. Now, say a child is doing really well in therapy and, no negative reactions, they're maintaining, the behavioral characteristics that, we're expecting or have written in their goals. They don't seem to be affected by their stuttering socially, so they're doing really well. But the stuttering hasn't gone away.
Mm-hmm.
And the parents keep asking, I want my child to stay in therapy because he's still stuttering. The stuttering hasn't gone away yet, and we're going to stay in stuttering therapy until it does. How do we handle that?
I think there's a lot of parent education that needs to go on there, and really sit down with the parents and explain to them, again, what causes stuttering, what the long-term prognosis is, what the goals of therapy are. And I think most of the time when you do that, parents come on board with what you want to accomplish in therapy. There are cases, though, where you can sit down and have those discussions with parents pretty consistently, and they still just want complete elimination. And I do think at some point, if that's the case, you have to sit down and be kind of direct and say, that's probably not going to happen, and so if we can't get on board with what the goals are, then doing speech therapy is not really going to be that big of a help. But my bigger concern in those situations is always what goes on at home.
Mm-hmm.
Because if they're not happy with perfect fluency, then they're creating an expectation that the child can't possibly meet. And so anything that the child does in terms of making progress is going to be looked at as a failure.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really important to let parents see that aspect of it, that if you start creating expectations that people can't realistically meet, that's not about setting good goals, that's about setting people up for failure.
Sure. And I think, too, it comes back to being ethical in our practice. What can we ethically set as a realistic goal and expectation for these children and adults who we suspect are going to stutter long term? We can't be seeing a 25-year-old client and saying, okay, by the end of therapy, we're expecting you to eliminate your stuttering or to leave therapy as a completely fluent person. Number one, completely fluent people don't exist. We're all disfluent to some degree. Now, we don't all stutter, but every single speaker is disfluent. So we really have to look at our goals and their appropriateness and, if we're being ethical in those recommendations as well. Okay, here's a case scenario. I recently had a client who did not seem to have any negative reactions to his stuttering, but his family is concerned. With this in mind, how do you know when treatment is appropriate, and what recommendations would you have in terms of treatment and talking with parents?
Well, I think you first have to figure out why they're concerned. And if maybe there are legitimate reasons why they're concerned, and the child might be in denial about those reasons, or they're seeing specific things that maybe the child isn't really willing to admit yet at this point. So I think bringing the parents and the child together and having them both give their perspectives maybe in front of each other is a good idea too, because it might help bridge that divide in terms of what the perspectives are right now. I think if it ends up that a parent has an unrealistic expectation for what the child should be doing, or thinks that it impacts the child when it doesn't really impact them or just impacts the parent more, then you have to focus more on, again, the parent education aspect of it.
Absolutely, and I think also we need to think about the age of the child here as well. So if we're talking about a preschool child who doesn't have a lot of negative reactions, maybe even awareness about their stuttering, but they're stuttering and the parent is concerned, that's a risk factor. So we really want to be thinking about the risk factors with these children, male, family history, temperament, other speech and language issues as well, to give ourselves a really complete picture about the appropriateness of therapy moving forward. What are some accommodation recommendations that you would give teachers for school-age children who stutter?
Another really good question. One of the biggest things involves oral reading activities, and you really got to make sure that people are not judging a child's oral reading abilities on whether or not they're disfluent or how disfluent they might be for a child who stutters. A child who stutters is going to be disfluent, and that has no reflection of their oral reading capabilities. So in that case, you have to really make sure that you're not assessing oral reading skill based on disfluencies in reading. The other thing is, I think there has to be accommodations for time. There shouldn't be time pressure or a time limit on somebody when they're stuttering in terms of reading out loud or speaking out loud. I think expectations should be very similar to a person who doesn't stutter in terms of overall communication, but I think a child should not be graded on fluency and judged on fluency or time ability to finish in a certain amount of time.
Going back to the parents for our last question here, let's say you have a child and the parent does not want to talk about stuttering, but the child clearly needs to be seen for stuttering therapy to target both the observable characteristics as well as the emotions and reactions under the surface. But parents are really resistant either to talking about stuttering themselves and using the term stuttering with their children. How do we handle that in a way that's sensitive?
A lot of that comes back to a myth that still exists a little bit today that perpetuated for a number of years, where people thought that if you talk about stuttering with a child, that it would essentially doom them to a lifetime of stuttering because you were labeling it. Mm-hmm. That's been proven beyond a shadow of a doubt at this point to not be true. And really, there is no risk at all about talking about stuttering in front of or with a child. I think we always have to remember that the less we're willing to talk about something, the more mysterious it becomes to a child. And so, clearly, if a child is talking to you and they are doing this when they talk, they know there's something different about their speech. They know it sounds different. They know it feels different. They know it's a lot of work and effort for them to get out words at times when it's not that same amount of work or effort for other people. And I think not acknowledging that, really, you run a risk of making stuttering more mysterious than it actually is. And then kids start to think, wow, this is so bad that nobody will even talk about it. Mm-hmm. So I think sitting down with a kid, having a really open, honest discussion and addressing stuttering in a matter-of-fact way and just saying, stuttering is something that happens when your words get stuck. It's not something to be ashamed of. We still want to hear what you have to say. I think it's really important to have those conversations early with kids.
Absolutely, and as Craig mentioned, some of the research that's kind of perpetuated this idea that if you talk about stuttering, the kid is going to be doomed as a stutterer long term. We know that's not true, so I'll even talk about the research that's been done so the parents can understand that theory in a more historical context, and then I'll follow that up with how much research has been done since that time that shows that stuttering is largely genetically or neurophysiologically based to help them understand the underpinnings of stuttering, and that we can talk about it in a healthy way that's supportive of the child, and then moving forward we can then work on reaching those realistic goals together as a team.
One of the really interesting dichotomies, I guess, of that whole theory and thought process is that on the one hand, people were really into trying to send the message that stuttering was okay still. On the other hand, it was, well, we don't want to, quote, doom you to a life of stuttering. very hard to send that message when you look at it from that perspective. I guess if I were having that conversation with a parent, and I would ask, so what's the long-term ramification if your child does stutter into adulthood? Does it mean that they can't have a good life? No. I think you can still be really successful as a person who stutters and be proud of being a person who stutters. It doesn't mean that you have to love it, but it's really important to have that mind frame and go into it with that thought process for the parents and the child, because otherwise you're not creating a condition that people fear might exist forever. If it does, so what? You adjust to it.
And I think that's a really important thing to talk about with parents, either at the assessment or very early on in therapy, that your kid might stutter long term, but our goal is going to be to not let this stuttering limit whatever goals your child has down the road. If he wants to be a musician, an architect, in finance, and happens to stutter, we don't want him to change what his ultimate goals are. He can be very successful as a person who stutters, and ultimately that's the direction that we want to help support during the therapy process. Okay, thanks everyone.